everybody, and welcome back to Autumn Leigh at Home. I'm Autumn Leigh. Today we are going to practice water bath canning strawberry jam and making strawberry jam together. We recently as a family went to a strawberry farm and we were able to get some beautiful strawberries. I cut them up, put them in the freezer for a time that we could now do this. So I'm really excited to get started because these are great for gifts that you can give other people, as well as use it for PB&Js. My daughter is obsessed with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And so instead of using grape jelly from the store, I'm able to use strawberry jam that we make here at home. Before we get started, I do want to pause and say thank you so much to all the new subscribers that I have. Thank you for joining this journey. I hope that if you have any questions at all, please feel free to comment below, hit that like button. If you are new to canning, this is the perfect place for you. We are learning together. I'm trying one new thing at a time. I've been canning for about 2 years now, so we've been able to practice some, and we'll re-practice again this year as each season opens up new vegetables and fruit. I'm so excited to try again and try new things as well. If you have been a canner for a long time, please stick around. We have a lot of questions, and I'm sure that this community would love all of your advice. Please comment below if you have any of that advice to share. We would love to hear it. As we get started here, I am starting off with weighing my strawberries. Anytime I got strawberries from a farm and I didn't feel like we were going to go through them fast enough, I went ahead and cut them up, cut the leaves off of them, put them up in a freezer bag in the freezer and labeled them for what they were. And then now that it's time to can them, I'm really excited because all we have to do is pull them out of the freezer and weigh them. So I zeroed out the basket. I tiered it, meaning that you zero it out so that it doesn't add the weight in there. And then I added the strawberries in there frozen. Once we do this, I'm going to rinse them off and let them thaw in the sink while I get everything else ready. I couldn't decide which basket or bowl to use. I started off with the red basket that we had gotten the strawberries in because I thought it would be easier to rinse them off in this, but then realized that because we need 4 to 5 pounds of strawberries, as I was adding these and they were frozen, they were not wanting to fit in there. So I switched to a metal bowl to weigh them and then switched back to this to rinse them off. As they were thawing, they were able to fit a little easier. I'm doing my best this time to follow the instructions very precisely from the ball canning book, and I will link below where the ball canning book that I have. However, there are many different recipes you can choose from. This one in particular has a lot of sugar, and I will say last year when I made this, I made strawberry jam before I even started this YouTube channel, and it turned out not runny, but more runny than you would want jam to be typically. So we still are eating it and it still tastes fantastic, still tastes like strawberries, and the taste has no problem. It's just the texture. This year I'm really hoping to, by following the instructions precisely, that we will get a little bit better of a texture. The other one that we made last year, I'm not going to throw it out. It's still going to get used. We love using it on pancakes, or I've found that it works really well making sourdough breads. If I want sourdough jam bread, which sounds kind of strange, but it tastes fantastic, as well as other recipes that call, or you can mix in really neat ingredients and just kind of have fun with it. So even Pop-Tarts, homemade granola bars, things like that, it's been fantastic for it. I haven't had any problems with it. However, because I would love to be able to use these as gifts, I don't feel comfortable giving a gift that it didn't turn out quite right. So if these turn out better, then this is something that I can use as gifts later on, whether it be for Christmas, for family, or different things. I have found that homemade stuff is just really fun because you don't see it as much anymore, and it took time for me to do it, so it was made with love, and I want to be able to share that with others. Now that our strawberries are rinsed and cleaned and they're thawing in the sink, I am going to take my time to wash each jar. They were washed after use. Whenever I opened up a jar and used it, I washed it in the dishwasher. Because they sit on my shelves, I want to take the time to wash them again by hand just to make sure that they're nice and clean, because you want everything to be clean. In the past, it used to be that you were supposed to sterilize your jars prior to using them. However, recent studies show that that is not necessary anymore, and I will link that down in the description. If you want to go and visit that website that talks about that, I will make sure to link it down below. So it's not necessary, as long as your processing time is 10 minutes or greater, it's not necessary to sterilize your jars prior to. But of course, just common sense tells you you want to start off with everything as clean as possible. So I went ahead and took the time to wash my jars. Now I am preparing my jam by putting all my strawberries back in that middle bowl because the red basket just isn't big enough. So I'm going to add my sugar as well as my pectin here. The only variance that I had from the recipe that I'm using from the ball canning book is that it calls for the ball pectin, which is that brand name pectin. It's the ingredient that helps you get that jelly consistency. I'm not using the ball brand name. I'm using Sure Gel, which is a different brand name. So I'm hoping that didn't really make a big difference and it will still turn out. If it doesn't turn out, then I will assume that would be the reason why, is because I'm using a different pectin. And the next time I do it, I either need to follow the Sure Gel instructions or find the ball pectin and use that brand name instead. So I will let you guys know one way or the other and how it turns out. However, right now it's time to add the pectin, and it calls for 6 tablespoons. And it didn't say to do this in the instructions, but I've been watching a bunch of other YouTubers that also make strawberry jelly. Becky from Acre Homestead does it, and I will link these videos down below as well. That way, if you want to practice and just watch multiple videos like me, I am such a visual learner. It helps me to see the right way of doing it as well as how other people do it as well. And practice makes perfect. And the more you watch it, the more you will become familiarized with it and it will feel more comfortable. So I will link her video down below if you wish to watch hers on top of mine as well. But she mixed her pectin in with her sugar, or at least a cup of sugar, before adding it into the strawberries. So that's what I did, even though the ball canning book did not specify that. So I did. The pectin is in the measuring cup, and then I'm adding 1 cup of sugar, and I'm using 1/3 cup because that's just what fits in the mouth of my jar. And then obviously because it's 1/3, I'm doing it 3 times. So I'm doing it to equal 1 cup of sugar. This recipe calls for 7 cups of sugar, which again is a lot. And I believe Becky from Acre Homestead, the video I linked below, she uses a less sugar option. So if that's something that you're interested in, I might try that next time. I just am trying to nail down the texture before I switch anything up. But if you want to try the less sugar option, then you can follow her video as well. Once I mixed the 6 tablespoons of pectin and 1 cup of sugar, I just kind of left it there and pushed pause because I realized I wanted to go ahead and get my jars warming on the stove. The idea is to have all of your items the same temperature, so the liquid of the jam that's being cooked as well as your jars and the liquid that you're putting your jars in and out of. You want everything to be warm and kind of steamy, because if you don't, you run the risk of your jars cracking and busting. And with it being water bath canned, or even if you're pressure canning, obviously you don't want either of that to happen, because not only would it ruin your jar and you would lose the stuff inside, but then you run the risk of cracking and busting other jars as well. So it's just best to try to keep everything about the same temperature and kind of hot/warm. And so right now what I'm doing is filling up each jar so that it doesn't float in the water, and then filling the pot where the water is just above the jars, because once you take the jars out of the water, you're going to be pouring the water that's in the jars back into the pot, and that will give you that 1 inch above the jars when you're done. You want to see 1 inch of water above the jars when you go to water bath can. So by doing it this way, it just works out well because it usually is about the right level of water. So once I get my jars all filled up and the pot filled up, I'm going to then put it on the stove and put it to a simmer. You don't want these boiling quite yet. All you're doing is trying to warm up the jars so that they're the same temperature as the jam when you go to put the jam inside them. Now that we have our jars warming on the stove, it's time to get back to mixing up our ingredients. So here I'm pouring the 1 cup of sugar mixed with the 6 tablespoons of pectin onto the strawberries, and you take a potato masher and you just mash them up. So right now, because mine were in the freezer, it actually was a lot easier once they thawed to mash them, just because they get a little bit more of a moist texture versus a firm texture of strawberries, but really as long as your strawberries are ripe, it shouldn't be a problem. You should be able to somewhat easily mash them. And mixed with this, it smelled so good. It smelled very sweet and springtime, which just made me so happy for summer coming as well. But we mash all of these up to the texture that you think jam should be. And keep in mind that all the sugar that you're putting in here is going to melt, and it's going to look a lot more liquidy than it does now. So don't panic if you feel like yours is too thick. It more than likely is not. Once you get it onto the stove and you start cooking it down, it will become a more liquidy texture as well. If you are new to canning, I know this can seem like so many steps and seem really overwhelming. My best recommendation is to watch the YouTube channels, watch the videos, read the instructions. All the terminology can be, again, overwhelming when you're first getting started, like headspace, what does that mean? Processing time, I don't know what that means either. Just learn one thing at a time, and over time you will look back and see how much more simple it becomes with each time that you do it. Again, I've been doing this for about 2 years, and I would still say I have to follow and reread the instructions often. So do not feel alone. We are all in this together. We are learning together. I made a separate video that talks about the difference between pressure canning and water bath canning and what that looks like and all the pieces and tools that are typically used when you're canning in general. So I will link that video onto the end of this if you are interested in kind of watching that to get a baseline first. If you are new to canning, I would strongly recommend water bath canning first. It's a lot more simple, it's easier, and there are still many things that you can do with water bath canning that doesn't require as much thought process as pressure canning does. I did not grow up in a family that does pressure canning or water bath canning or canning of any sort, or really gardening for that matter. And so this is something that I'm self-taught / self-teaching myself currently, and I would love to share that journey with you guys. And if you have any questions, I will do my best to also find the answers, so feel free to comment below. But getting back to the recipe, I added my 7 cups of sugar, which sounds like a whole lot, and I completely understand that. That is something that, again, maybe next time I can try the less sugar option. But that's what it's made of. It's supposed to be sweet. It's supposed to be a sweet treat that you spread on bread or other items and baked items. So it's going to have a lot of sugar, unfortunately. Even the less sugar option still calls for 4 to 5 cups, I believe. But once I added my 7 cups of sugar, I then added 1/4 cup of lemon juice. After all of that, I mixed it all up, and now I'm pouring it into the big pot that I'm going to then sit on the stove. Once I have it in the big pot, my goal for on the stove is to bring it to a rolling boil. This means when you go to stir it and you see the bubbles, that you are unable to stir the bubbles away. So even though you're stirring, the bubbles are continuously rolling, and that's a rolling boil. Once your jam gets to a rolling boil, you want to set a timer for 1 minute and allow it to be a rolling boil for 1 minute. During this time, you are able to skim off that frothy looking foam on the top if you wish to. Now, we're going through all this trouble. It doesn't hurt to try to make them look pretty, but in this moment, in this day, I was more concerned with getting everything warm at the same time. So I did siphon some of it off onto the top, and all you do to do that is take a spoon and gently scrape it off the top. And with jam, it makes it a little trickier because it's kind of chunky, but see all that frothy light pink on top, and it sits right there on top. That's the foamy part that you can scrape off. It's just extra. It's not a big deal. If you leave it, it doesn't change the taste. It just changes maybe the look at the top of the jar. While this is coming up to a rolling boil and then boiling for 1 minute, I do go ahead and take the time to get a clean dish towel out, because when you pull the jars out of that hot water, you don't want to sit them on a cold counter. You want to sit them on a dish towel or some sort of layer that's going to keep them from cracking. Now I get my basket of canning items out. This is just to grab the jars to hold them because they're going to be hot. You don't want to touch them. The funnel is to allow you to have less spill. However, I am a very messy canner. I tend to spill it all over my rags. This is to measure headspace, and you can see the teeth at the top. Each one is 1/4 inch, and so depending on what you're canning, it will tell you which headspace to use, and use that to measure the headspace. Once I get my canning tools out and ready to go, I look for the canning lids or rings, excuse me, and I want to inspect each ring to make sure there's no rust, that they're clean, and that there's no dents. The rust obviously can cause issues with the whole cleanliness of your jam. You obviously don't want to use rusty lids or rings. And then as far as the dents, you want to inspect them kind of quickly as you go just to make sure that there's no dents, because that can run the risk of your jars not sealing properly during the canning process. This water was not boiling. However, as you can see by the steam, it was very hot. So you want to be very careful not to touch the pot or to touch each jar or the hot water on the inside. That's what this tool is for. It's so nifty, so then you don't burn yourself. And you want to pour the water back into the pot, because once you fill these jars and you put the jars back into the hot water, you want the water to come at least an inch above the jars. After getting all of the jars out of the hot water, I'm going to put my pot back on the stove with the burner on so that it stays warm. Again, you don't want the water to be boiling. You just want it to stay warm enough so that when you put the hot jars back into it, you want everything to be about the same temperature. Now it's time to get my ladle and go ahead and start spooning the jam into the hot jars while the jam is hot. So the trickiest part is kind of the timing of getting both of these done at the same time. Ultimately, canning really isn't hard. To be honest, it's a lot of waiting around, which is not something that you see during the video making and during the videoing process. It's a lot of, go, go, go. Once you get it on the stove, you get to just kind of stand there and wait until everything comes to a boil or becomes hot. So really, it's just the timing of getting both of those done at the same time with water bath canning. Pressure canning is a little bit of a trickier story, but with water bath canning, once you get it on the stove, it's also nice because you don't have to stand there and watch it, which pressure canning you do. So water bath canning, once it's on the stove and it comes to a rolling boil, you can walk away, set the timer for 10 minutes, walk away, and as long as it's at that rolling boil, you are good to go. As you can tell, I'm using two different size jars. One is a half pint jar, and that's the small one, as well as a pint jar, which is the larger one. Both, I looked up the processing time, both are 10 minutes. So again, because we're doing it for at least 10 minutes, that means we didn't have to sterilize our jars. But I'm filling each of these up with up to about 1/4 inch headspace, and that's where that measuring tool with the little teeth and stair-stepping plastic looked like. That's what that's used for. If I'm being completely honest, the only reason I'm using two different size jars is because I didn't have enough half pint jars, because I've given a lot of them away, which is what I intended them to do. However, I haven't had the chance to go back and buy more half pint jars. So with this family, because again, my daughter eats so much peanut butter and jelly, I try to change up her diet, but when I do make her peanut butter and jellies, I'm able to use this jam, which is fantastic. And so we will go through a pint pretty easily without any problems or it going bad quickly. We want 1/4 inch headspace, which is all very small and all the way there at the tip of the measuring device. And all you do is slide it around the rim on that one stair step or level to determine whether it's high enough, the liquid is high enough to the rim of the jar. The headspace is the amount of air that's between the liquid and what will be the lid once you put it on. And we want 1/4 headspace. So once I measure with it, then I go around and kind of re-level everything out. If some don't have enough liquid in them, then I use the last little bit to do it. And to be honest, this made the perfect amount for the jars that I made. It doesn't normally work out that way. Normally I have some left over or not quite enough for another jar, and you just stick it in the fridge and use it. But we were able to make the perfect amount for the jars that I had chosen, and that worked out really well. Watching this footage back, I will say I missed a crucial step in the canning process. So again, we're not perfect. We make mistakes, and I want to be transparent with you guys. So one of the steps that I missed was the debubbling process. So after I pour all of the jam into the jars, it's crucial that you debubble the jars. And what that means is you take either the end of a spoon or a chopstick or I sometimes tend to use the tip of the headspace measuring tool to debubble. So I flip it upside down, and all I do is you kind of wiggle it around in each jar, trying to get any air pockets or bubbles that might be trapped underneath the jam out, and that can change your headspace. Before you measure headspace, that is a crucial step, because if you have too much air trapped, it can also cause your jars to not seal properly. And thankfully, looking back at this footage, I just went and checked and all of my jars have sealed, so it did not affect my sealing process this time, but I would strongly recommend not skipping that process. After debubbling and re-measuring out headspace and adjusting headspace, you take white vinegar or a damp, wet washcloth, and your goal is to wipe each of the rims off to get any sticky stuff and residue off of the rims. If you don't, again, you run the risk of not having a proper seal and your jars unsealing later on. And the white vinegar helps with that. Again, you can just use water if you don't have white vinegar. That's fine too. While wiping down the rims with the damp towel or with white vinegar, I would also encourage you to check for any nicks or dings on the rim of your jar because that can cause you not to have a proper seal. After you're confident that you have all of the sticky residue off the rims of your jars, it's time to go ahead and gently set the lids on top without touching that rubber part of the seal, because your oil on your hands could again cause you to have a greater risk of not having a proper seal. And then you take your rings and you put them finger tight. Now be careful, the jars have hot liquid in them. The jars themselves are hot because they came out of hot liquid. I was trying to put the jars on without having to use a rag, but it can burn your hands, so just be very careful. You want to put the rings on finger tight, and what that means is you spin the ring until you meet resistance, and then you just do a little bit further. Now that all of our rings are on and our jars are ready to go, we want to pull the pot of hot water back off the stove and over onto the counter, and you're going to gently place each jar down onto the rack. You want to make sure that there's a layer between your jars and the bottom of a pot. So you don't have to use this pot in particular. I know it's sold at Walmart or many other places as the water bath canning pot. You can really use any pot as long as there is a layer between your jars and the pot itself, because you don't want your jars to crack from rattling around in there and or be on direct heat themselves. So you can put a rag down at the bottom of your pot and that would work just fine. Processing time for these jars in particular is 10 minutes, and what that means is they will be at a rolling boil for 10 minutes. You don't want to start the timer before you see that rolling boil. This is the part that feels like a waiting game because you finally get the pot on the stove and you put it on high or medium high to get the temperature of the water up to a rolling boil. And this is what a rolling boil looks like. Even if I were to stir this, it does not go away. That's what you want to see. So now I can set my timer for 10 minutes and then I can take it off. The part of the video that you aren't being shown, which is kind of the boring part, is that standing there watching water to boil is something that they strongly don't recommend because it seems like it takes forever. So when you're canning, it's always good, to entertain yourself by cleaning all the dishes that you just messed up or being in the kitchen just to make sure everything's going okay, but you don't necessarily have to stand there and babysit the pot. Once your the timer has gone off, it's been 10 minutes, you want to leave the pot on the stove. You don't want to open it and immediately take the jars off. Let the pot of water kind of cool down just a little bit. I usually leave mine for the rest of the day, and then that evening, which is now, I take the jars out and again put a clean dish rag down and sit the jars on top of the rag so that they can cool down to room temperature for the next 12-ish hours. You also don't want to retighten these rings down. A lot of them become loose during the boiling process. Just leave them alone. Don't retighten them. Leave them on until the next day when the jars have cooled, and then you can take them off before sitting them in your pantry. If you leave the rings on, you run the risk of a false seal, which means that you have a jar that may have opened and unsealed and then resealed itself because of the pressure in the room, whether it becomes hot or cold. That changes the pressure and can cause your jars to reseal after they've been opened for maybe a week or so. And then obviously you don't want that because it can cause mold or for the food to go bad, and you may not have realized it because the ring held that lid on and resealed it. Hey everybody, I just wanted to take this time to say thank you so much for joining me here at Autumn Leigh at Home. I'm so grateful that we were able to learn and practice doing strawberry jam today. Please like, subscribe, and share, and I hope to see you guys next time. Hey everybody, and welcome. I don't know, I'm doing the welcome.